Hey everyone, welcome to the Fortress of Solitude podcast. I'm your host, Sergio Pereira, and today it's the final episode of 2020. I know, it's been that kind of year and we probably want to see the back of it, but we're going to end it off on a super high note. We're going to be discussing The Sandman. And yes, I'm talking about The Sandman, the comic book series, not that stupid character from Spider-Man. And today, I am joined by South African, we're going to say she's probably one of the best authors. I'd say my favorite author in South Africa, without a doubt. She is a fantasy author and editor, book reviewer, and all-round really cool person, Nerine Dorman. Nerine, how are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. I'm on my second cup of coffee, so yeah.
I mean, that's to be said. I think, this year, 2020, has been the year that we just might as well just, put it into our veins to deal with it. But moving along. Now, we are obviously here to discuss The Sandman. And I know for a fact that you're a huge, huge fan of both Neil Gaiman and The Sandman. So tell me, where and when was your first introduction to The Sandman? How did you get introduced to the comic book series?
Oh gosh, we're talking probably mid-90s. I was in high school still, and I was one of the people who used to go and hang out with the university students up at the claw room. I don't know if you ever heard about the claw room. No,
I haven't.
Thing. No, it's like all the role players and the gamers. It was like back in the day before, internet was actually really a thing. I mean, I think a lot of those people probably hung out on IRC because, it was that sort of crowd. So we were like all role playing and doing that kind of stuff because we were like super not cool. And a friend of mine, he was studying computer programming and he had the entire Sandman collection, which he was lending to me. And I just remember that this was like a cosmic 2x4 that hit me upside the head. I was like, this is frigging amazing. It had everything. It was like, I think it's just because it's so ridiculously postmodern. It rifles the pockets of all the popular culture. I mean, I don't know comic books very well, but I read an article a while ago that was basically showing all the notes that Neil Gaiman hits when he does Sandman. He just literally goes through the entire oeuvre of works and he shamelessly drags it in. And I think if you know your comic books well, you'll recognize like the more obscure references, but you can see that he wears his love of comic book culture on his sleeve, which is just so amazing to see. Look, I don't know it well enough as I should, as you've recommended comic books to me when I've had a yen for it. But what struck me about The Sandman was that it was like it was just this. At a glance, it seems to be this formless, just absolute miasma of stories. But a story about stories and about storytellers. And it's so meta. And I think what's amazing about it is that two people will read it and they'll get a completely different experience from it because there'll be different notes that resonate with them. I mean, who doesn't love Dream of the Endless? And I mean, gosh, I admit to cosplaying death when I was young and well, I weighed considerably less than I do right now. But it was nothing like it.
Yeah. No, that's the thing about it, and I think you're spot on there about it. It just was so very original. I mean, I'll be honest with you. My introduction to The Sandman, I've known about this comic book series for ages, but it was only a few years ago that I actually picked it up.
Oh.
Because before that, like I remember, like there used to be a comic book store in Edenvale called ZB's. Shout out to ZB's, long departed, and I used to go in there and I used to see the Sandman covers and it just used to look, it was the Dave McKean sort of artwork on it. And I was thinking to myself, that is incredible. But it was just always so out of my price range at the time. I used to just always go to the sales rack and see what I could get. And the Sandman just was never there. And it was only a few years ago that I actually, also through a friend, I started reading a couple of the issues. And then eventually my fiance actually bought me like the first volume, the preludes and I think nocturnes, if I'm not mistaken. And that's also like what you say. It's like you read it and my impression of what the Sandman was to what I got was so completely different.
Yeah.
And it was just, and like you said, there's nothing else like it.
I think also just a word of a backstory here. I ended up studying graphic design. I know. And Dave McKean was probably one of the greatest influences on my artwork. I mean, at the time I was majoring in illustration because I thought, most of the jobs we do today weren't even in existence back then. I mean, we're talking a good 20 years or more ago. So back at those days, I thought I was going to become an illustrator. And Dave McKean's covers for the Sandman was so hugely influential on me. And also back in that stage, deconstruction, or decon as we called it back in design terms, it was very 1990s. If you do it now, it's like, oh, hello, 1990 called their graphic designer here. But I love decon. And I mean, as much as I hate postmodernism and sometimes in the philosophies, I love postmodernism in design because it's just so shamelessly plays with things, and it's got a sense of adventure that breaks away from the 1980s in a big way. But anyway, look, I hate 1980s design. Don't even get me started. These covers, I mean, before I could even afford it, they brought out a hardcover of all the dust covers collected in one book. And I remember it was back then, it was 600 Rand. And I pawned my soul to own that book. And now I'm tempted, of course, to do the whole boxed set, but we've already got most of the Sandman in paperback. And I admit, I also went and I bought the first edition of Dream Hunters back in the day before I could actually afford it. And although and I know this is a strange thing to admit, but I haven't read the most recent ones, the new ones. I think I was waiting for all of it to come together in one volume. And my life being as chaotic as it is, I haven't actually looked into it. But, Neil Gaiman's weird. There's a lot of his work that I haven't read. And it's not because I don't want to. It's just because I'm scared to, because I don't want to run out. I don't know.
No, I get you. It's like, it's actually kind of funny. I was listening to, it was another comic book podcast, Word Balloon, the other day, and there was one of the writers on there. He was saying that he keeps, like, with some authors and some of like his favorite, like, comic book people as well, he keeps certain things that he doesn't want to read because he doesn't want to run out of material in case that's the last thing he reads. Like, he needs to have something. So it's quite funny to say about Neil Gaiman, because I'm also in the same boat. I've pretty much got his entire like book collection, his bibliography. I got everything, but there are just certain things I haven't touched yet because I'm just like, I'm keeping it for a rainy day, like when you really need a story. And that's the way I feel about all of this stuff as well.
But I mean, reading has become such a what's the word I'm looking for? It's become such a treat. I think back to when I was in high school and also when I was at university, not really in university, but still sort of high school days. Somehow I managed to generate time to read. I would go through about 2 or 3 paperbacks a week. And I'm not just talking about paperbacks. I'm talking about door stoppers like Kate Elliott, Catherine Kerr, a lot of people like that who don't write small books. And I remember reading till like 2:30 in the morning sometimes. And now I get to 10:30 and I lie in my bed. I manage one chapter. I'm not
bedtime knockout.
Yeah, I mean, look, granted, we're in a very demanding industry. I don't know what I can't explain to people what I do for a living anymore because I don't do just one thing. Back in the day when you go to university or you do some sort of college course as a tertiary education or even just straight from high school, you think you're going to go into a career. And some people might even have a very definite idea of what they want. And I suppose if you're a dentist or a physiotherapist, that's pretty certain. But for people like us in the media industry, it shifts and evolves so rapidly. And I mean, I'm sure you find the same thing, that you do various different things. It's not just
all the time. Yeah, all the time. So, I get you.
So I mean, like, I do write books, and sometimes I make nice bits of money from my writing, especially when I write tie-in fiction for role-playing games. But that's a lovely industry to work in. But I also edit books, and I do graphic design, and I do part of my work I do is in the film industry, doing graphics and making props. And then the bulk of my income is also just from the pet food industry, because I do design for a leading pet food brand. And my day can be anywhere between busy editing a very raunchy erotic romance novel, and then I'll skip over to doing pet food. It doesn't. There's not one thing. But at least it's from home. It's not working from an office anymore. Thank goodness.
That's true. But obviously now, going back to the Sandman, what do you think it does better than anything else in the medium? Because I'm gonna like share a story here. Like, I know that everyone is crazy about Alan Moore's work, and especially the stuff he did with Watchmen and, you know, significant stuff as well. Like we look at other stuff at what was his name again? It's on top of my tongue. Frank Miller. That's what Frank Miller did with like the Dark Knight Returns and a lot of those sort of comics that came out in the 80s that they said, you know, it kind of shifted the tide and it made sure that, you know, it went from, you know, series that were supposed to be for kids, it became something a lot more serious that, you know, adults could also get into the stories. But I've got to be honest with you here. I think for me, the Sandman did a lot more for that change because of the stories and the way that it's done, you know, in terms of like, it brings sort of a literary focus into the comic book medium. It becomes something more, and I think it's deeper, like the meanings. And I remember reading it's the first issue where basically Dream meets Death, his sister. And, you know, she's showing, like, she's basically going around to different people and, you know, they basically die. Yeah. And it was kind of sad, like, seeing a certain thing. There was one image where was a lady that her baby was in the cot. And then she flipped over the baby, and obviously the baby passed away. Yep. And the mother came in, and she was, like, obviously in tears. It was devastating. And it was one of the most powerful sort of, like, single scenes I've seen in comic book, you know, history.
I'm going to stop your lorry right here. You think that scene was powerful in the comic book? The graphic, not the graphic novel, so the audiobook reduced me to tears at 2 occasions. I mean, I normally listen to I'm going to make an admission. I do my listening to audiobooks while I wash the dishes. And then I was elbow deep in soapy suds, bawling my eyes out because of this audiobook of that scene, that particular scene. And look, I don't have kids. I don't really like children either, but I can tap into that raw emotion of that voice actress as she was portraying a woman who's just lost her child. And I stood there crying at the dishes. It's like, no. And that's the power of the story. The comic book medium does a lot for it because you've got the visual elements. And in that sense, you've got more dimensions. But having written the comic book myself, I also know that you lose out on a lot that you would normally have in fiction. So when you translate that to the audiobook, now you've got people having to imagine and make the pictures themselves. Now, the thing is, I don't know how many times I've read that particular scene in the comic book, but listening to it on the audiobook, I had an idea of what it was coming. So I could already paint the picture in my head, but now you've got the sound to go with it and the emotion of the voice actor. Oh Lordy, I was in tears. And that's the thing. There's something there with Neil Gaiman's writing that, I mean, look, don't get me wrong. The Frank Miller is amazing, and those other comic books you mentioned. I mean, they were really groundbreaking. You know, dark as all hell. But I think that the underlying thing with the Sandman, which makes it stand head and shoulders above, is a sense of wonder.
Yeah. And
the fact of how small we are and how inconsequential we are, but yet still imbued with meaning.
Yeah, exactly. And that was like the point I was going to come to as well, was that even in that scene that is so tragic, like the way that issue wraps up, it becomes a discussion about hope. And it becomes a discussion about like how, you know, the way that people, you know, they see death, the way that we see death, and we see death as final. And, you know, and just the way it is, it's just like, it's a different discussion. And that's a thing that I think it does really well. It manages to balance the dark with, you know, a bit of optimism, a bit of light, if you want to say that. And that's what I think, you know, is something that a lot of people miss about the Sandman.
And it's just the intertextuality with other art forms. I think that's the big thing. I mean, we've also got a healthy dipping into mythology. Look, I come to the Sandman from the myths and legends. I mean, look, if you know me even a little bit, you know that I'm completely mad about Egypt. And there was a particular scene in the Sandman that made me so happy. It was basically about the goddess Bast, and the idea that the gods sort of fade when they don't have people believing in them. And she goes on a mission. That particular story wasn't in the audiobook, and I need to revisit it, but how she sort of gathers power. And I think one of the little scenes is like a young boy who's at a cat show, who's looking at the cats in the cages, and just for one moment he looks into the face of a cat and he sees the eyes of a goddess or something like that. And I get goose flesh when I think about that. And I think about one of the very first short stories I ever wrote. I mean, it was basically just like Neil Gaiman fan fiction, really. And it was basically about Bust and Loki and a stolen pot of mead. I think it's on my DeviantArt page somewhere. It's so bad. It's a bad story. It's probably hopping all the worst mistakes of newbie writers. But there's something so charming about it that I enjoyed writing. And in hindsight, I think I'm too embarrassed to go back and read it. But it's sort of just that whole idea of taking what Neil does is he takes things and he breathes life into them. You know, he makes the gods people, you know, more so than what we, you know, would expect them. I mean, little stories like the one that gets to me, I think her name, oh gosh, I'm so bad with names. I might get her name wrong. The queen, the African queen who loves him, but she realizes that if she can't stay with him, because if she stays with him, it's sort of like just a great wrongness. So she chooses to spurn his love, and he punishes her by locking her in hell.
Yeah.
And I mean, you know, so he sort of, what Neil does is he gets all these sort of, he ties together the human condition together in this great melange of storytelling. He really, honestly, I think it's just the fact that he is so well read that he's able to play with ideas like that. And I think as an author, that has probably been one of my greatest influences, of just being able to sort of look for a meta story and to touch notes with ideas that are powerful and that have meaning for people and have personal meaning. And I think that's where the Sandman can speak to people, because there's so many of them. I mean, if you look at the audiobook, obviously they had to cut down quite drastically. But it gives me hope for the series when the TV series comes out, because they've at least now Dirk Maggs has shown that it can be done. Because that was probably one of my first concerns of, like, how in heaven's name do you find a central story arc for the sprawling mass of comics that just went on for how many years? I think it was more than a decade, wasn't it? I can't even remember.
Yeah, it was. I mean, they had so many issues. And I mean, now obviously they've restarted spin-offs of it as well. So I mean, it hasn't stopped. But I mean, what I think is quite interesting is something that you mentioned there as well. And I just want to take a step back here, is that you mentioned about Neil Gaiman being very well read. And I completely agree, because I was reading some of the interviews with the editors at that stage of DC that became Vertigo. And they were saying that, you know, with Neil's ideas, that they're always just, especially at that stage, I think he was still quite young. He was in his 20s, if I'm not mistaken. And they say that, you know, the stuff that he was coming up with and the stuff that he was quoting and the stuff that he wanted to do, they were just like, wow, this is grand. You know, this is something else. And I think that's the thing with the Sandman, as you say, you can pull from any different sort of areas. I think that the first couple issues, they tried to tie in a little bit to the DC universe. Like, I mean, there were elements of Batman and Arkham. They obviously had mentions of it. But I think when it kind of stepped away from that and it's just decided it can be its own thing and it doesn't necessarily need to, you know, tie into everything else happening at DC, that's the way I think, you know, the Sandman really came to life, because it just became that universe. We weren't interested in, like, okay, I don't want to see the Sandman meet the Joker, for example. Like, you know, let's just leave them separate here.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's been so strong as a story, and that's why it stood out in the medium, because it actually managed, and it's something which I've got a very massive complaint about nowadays in terms of the big two, which is obviously Marvel and DC, that they rely too much on older characters. They rely too much on the likes of Batman and Superman, and it's just been like this for, you know, decades. I mean, it's what, like 80 years plus now, and they're not creating any new characters, any new innovative ideas. And whilst the Sandman was based on a character that was called the Sandman, they got completely reinvented, and it was something brand new. It was this whole entire new world, and I don't see that being created by the likes of Marvel and DC. It's all in the indie scene. And that's why, for me, I sometimes actually forget that the Sandman is part of DC, where I actually think it was an indie comic, because it feels like it. It feels like it's so free. It doesn't... You know, it does things that technically it shouldn't be allowed by corporates.
I think the thing also here nowadays is we live in a culture where I think a lot of the larger content creators are very nervous or hesitant to do new things, because, I mean, you can't even breathe and your very existence will upset somebody. That's sort of the feeling that I get. And talking just from a publishing perspective, when you're looking now, a lot of the bigger content creators are also sort of rather banking on the known quantities and paying fan service to something that is reliable. So it's very difficult for the newer people to sort of gain a foothold in that sense, because you've got Marvel and DC coming with all these dollars, and they just have a template. And unfortunately, look, I have gone to watch all the Avengers movies, and don't get me wrong, I love it. I'm more of a Marvel girl than a DC girl. But I see more exciting things happening now on streaming services than on the silver screen, to be quite honest. And if we look at how storytelling has shifted, back in the 1980s, if I think I think of how whenever a sequel was handled, it was never really paying attention to the story that came before that. So invariably the sequel was always a letdown. Yeah. I think the very first film that really bucked that trend would have been the Lethal Weapon and the Die Hard franchises. I think, look, I haven't watched any of them for a long time, but I know that Lethal Weapon actually did quite a good job of not falling into the traps of bad serials. So now if you look at how people falling into something like, for instance, The Witcher, which has got so much source material, and as well as the games that it can sort of lean on, that it sort of lends itself to taking care of people's needs. And also, just in terms of writing fantasy, people, although standalones are great, don't get me wrong, the trend these days tends towards serialization. So, and I think that's probably where, for instance, Marvel has gotten it right to a larger extent than DC, because they had a better overarching idea of where they were going. Yeah. So, and they had a stronger roadmap, and it shows. And that's perhaps also where something like Star Wars has failed. Don't get me wrong, I love Star Wars. I frigging love it. I'm not so mad about episodes 1 to 3, and the latter movies I have very strong opinions on, which I shall not get into here, otherwise we're going to end up...
Yeah, we don't talk about Star Wars on this podcast because we know we're going to be downvoted like to the ends of the earth. Like, it's literally one of the topics like we've avoided intentionally because they're like, oh no, Star Wars is like you're lifting a lid that you don't, it's Pandora's box online. That's it.
Yeah, look, I don't have as much time to read as much as I want to, and I really want to. There's a part of me that really wants to spend an entire Christmas holiday and lie on my couch and just go through all the Sandman comics again, and revisit some of the other comic books, because there's something so pleasurable about dipping into that. There's no stress involved, and or even just binge watching a series. I just wish I could do that. And that's the nice thing these days about media, is the fact that there's going to be more coming from that source. It's not like this absolutely disjointed storytelling where they've obviously got a new production company that's hopped in and now they want to put their stamp on a product, and then you end up with, okay, if you want to look at terrible storytelling, the Highlander franchise. Oh my gosh, it's bad. We do not talk about Highlander 2. And then from Highlander 3, they sort of half and half redeem it, and then by Highlander 4, it's, oh my goodness, no. And then of course the fact that the TV series goes on a sort of like a alternative universe tangent that doesn't really marry up with the movies, So, we're seeing less of that these days, because I think content creators and also just the production companies are realizing that they need to sort of play a long game, which is going to be interesting to see with the Sandman, because it will tie in with something like Lucifer, which has already got quite a fan following on streaming services, so far as I can tell. And then, of course, there's the books of, I'm going to get it wrong. I'm going to get the name of the Books of Dreaming. No. Man.
Yeah, they've got the Lucifer series. Obviously, the character, as we know, he spun off from obviously the Sandman. But it's sorry, go ahead.
There was a little spin-off comic book that came off after Sandman finished, and I am now oh gosh, I'm going to get it wrong. It was almost like a very Harry Potterish character. Look, I read it so long ago, and as I said, I've warned you up ahead. I'm terrible.
And that's all good.
But anyway, the Sandman itself has spawned assorted spin-offs in terms of comic books.
Yeah, so it's obviously got the option for TV as well that, we could see that happening.
So, we've got potential for so much content. But yeah, it's exciting.
Yeah, that is pretty cool. And the thing is, what I was reading about in terms of the Sandman TV series, and it was something Neil Gaiman said, was actually at the DC fandom event that he was a part of. And he said that it's going to be set in modern times. And this actually, kind of ties in, the final discussion point, is that I don't actually have a problem with that at all, because if you actually look at the Sandman, I believe it was ahead of its time. The way it just handles a lot of issues. Nowadays, things about transgenderism and, all these issues that exist today, there's a lot of big discussion and talking points about. It just treated it so naturally. I think the Sandman was just one of the very first comics to just treat this as this is all natural. The people that exist in this world, it's just, it's about acceptance.
Yeah, if you look at Desire as well, they are both, and I am very leery of content where they are more focused on the identity of the characters or even the writers or the readers rather than the actual stories. And I think this is where a lot of, and I know I'm going to go on a limb here and people are going to hate me, but this whole idea of focusing on identity rather than content or the quality of the story. I'm not saying that we should never deal with identity, because identity is actually central to a lot of the stories I write. But one should do it in such a way that it blends seamlessly with the story. And that's what Neil Gaiman does. If you look at, there's a character, oh man, as I said, I was going to be bad with names, in the Dollhouse. Oh man, I'm so bad with names. Anyway, but the characters just appear and they are who they are and they do what they do. And, and they have these epic adventures and they play pivotal roles in the story. And, they're just people. They're not special because of what they are. They're special because of what they do. Yeah,
I hear you. And that's what I think is quite strong about it. It's just it's all normalized in this world. It's not a case of that. As you're saying, sometimes I think that with certain stories, it can be too on the nose, the way they do certain things. It's it's too much here's this character and this character is this, or this character is that, and they have to spell it out to you because, they just feel that that's the right way. And I think sometimes when it's just treated as normal and fluid, it's just you don't, it's acceptance. And I think that's exactly what Neil Gaiman gets right. He's just got a very good understanding of that. And, putting the people in story, these are just people, these are just characters. These are this is what's important. They're integrated into the story. We don't need to, spell anything out for you effectively.
Yeah. It's, and that, I think that's why it is such an important sort of piece of cultural object, if you want to call it that. It's because of the fact that I think for a lot of people, it might be their first sort of experience of certain ideas. I know for me, I got into the Sandman at a very formative stage of my life. I must have been about 17 or 18. And, it just showed me, I come from a very conservative Afrikaans background. NG Kerk and the whole thing. So Sandman was a huge... Okay, I was already doing a pretty good job rebelling by the time I hit the Sandman. But the Sandman, when I read it, was such an incredible, validating experience. This, yes, this. I want to do stuff like this. I want to make stories that are free like this, that don't set themselves boundaries, that cross borders, that play outside of their lanes, that do things that don't ascribe to the conventions. And I'm sure you'll see that people harp on about the conventions in all sorts of media, and then when somebody comes out of and breaks those boundaries, people get upset. And I think it's important that people get upset. Because if you get upset about something, it means that you're having some sort of cognitive dissonance. And it's an opportunity to learn and maybe reconsider your stance on things. That's just how I see it.
Agreed, definitely. Nerine, thank you so much for joining us for the final podcast of the year. And for everybody listening, where can they find you on social media, your website? This is your chance to plug everything you want. It's like, it's a freebie here. Go for it.
Okay, I provide free entertainment on Twitter. My subtweets, my random tweets, my retweets. It's very easy. It's just at Nerine Dorman. I'm also on Facebook, but I've started getting to that point where I'm very selective about who I let into my circle because, as I said, I sometimes post stuff that upsets people. But yeah, find me on Twitter, find me on Instagram if you want to see all my cat pictures and my ducks and my geese and my dogs and random weird stuff. And yeah, and go buy my books. They're all on Amazon. Support me, make me fabulously wealthy so I can fix the curious green automobile that's under a tarpaulin in my yard. Yeah. So that's it. That's just it. But yeah, Twitter is probably the best place to follow me. And Instagram.
Fantastic. Awesome. And yes, people, please go and support Nerine. Go and buy her books. She's fantastic. I can vouch for that. And if you disagree, then you just got a wrong opinion. And everyone, thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And yeah, we'll hit you up next year with some brand new content, some brand new podcasts. Have a very safe festive season and see you in 2021. Hopefully it's a better year. Cheers.